frankly, this needn't be done. In any other country, we would have simply kept rolling along in a particular direction, and the judiciary and tribunals of the entire legal paraphernalia would by and large have been partners in this, rather than be seen as something that we have to somehow, a hurdle that we have to go past. Now, I'm not saying that this happens all the time. There have been many cases where the legal system does indeed help out. But on the whole, I would say, compared to the role that they could otherwise be expected to play, I'm afraid the legal system broadly, not just the judiciary, but the entire ecosystem of the legal system, from police to bar councils, the whole paraphernalia, has really failed to care. And this is very, very sad. But we have to do something about it. So if you read the latest economic survey, you will find that we have given a full chapter to this issue. It's only a very limited view of it. We had, by the way, even in the last economic survey, we had looked at the legal system and this issue. And we intend that the next one as well, we will revisit another aspect of it. But in this particular economic survey, we looked at purely the quantitative numbers related to the judicial system. So we looked at just the numbers, not at the quality. So here we are not even thinking about the quality of the judgments made, just at the numbers in a very, what should I say, mechanical way. But still we found something very interesting. We found that when you think of this entire system, 35 million cases stuck pending, etc., it seems like, this is a problem we'll never get around. So we said, okay, so let's try and see how much effort is needed if we genuinely attempted to try and solve it. So the first thing we discovered is that most of the problem is in the lower courts. 87% of these cases that are pending are in the lower courts. So we began to dig into how many judges would be needed, even retaining current levels of efficiency, in order to at least reach 100% clearance rate, which is that we clear as many cases as comes in. So we no longer add to the pending list. And we discovered we only need 2,300 more judges in the lower courts, and just 93 judges in the high courts, and one extra judge in the Supreme Court to achieve this. This is not only well within sanction strength, this happens to be peanuts for a country our size. You go anywhere in the world, even small countries would have no problem coughing up these many judges. This is net number of judges, so this is not, obviously you'll have to get more in because some are retiring, leaving the system in various ways. So, but nevertheless, additional 2,300 judges for a country our size, nothing. And yet we are unable to do this. But at least we have identified the number. Now we said, okay, supposing we wanted, if we somehow managed to reach sanction strength, what would be the efficiency gains that would be needed in order to be able to clear the entire backlog in 5 years? And we discovered that the numbers are trivial. 54% for the lower courts, 8% or something like that for the high court, just 8%, and 18% or something thereabouts for the Supreme Court. These are very small efficiency gains required. If you computerize a few things, get rid of some processes, we can easily do it. The point I'm making is not whether we should do it through better appointments or efficiency gains. I'm merely showing you that the numbers are very tractable. They are difficult and ambitious, but they are tractable. They are not intractable numbers that we have to simply accept as something God-given. This is a solvable problem, and I have argued, at least in the economic survey, this is top priority of the government. And if we had to invest in anything, rather than invest in a new airport or a new highways, if I had to spend 10,000 crores or something, I would be doing this. The multiplier effects for the rest of the economy from this would be dramatic. So, what I have tried to do in the last about 40 odd minutes, is to give you a flavor of how we think about the world, how ancient India used to think about the world, and how many of these things that many of you may be reading in your classrooms and so on connect through to the real world in which policy making is made. I'm now going to stop because I think there may be many interesting questions and maybe an interaction which you would find maybe you would like to have. So let me stop right here and open it up.
If you all have any questions, you can please ask.
Okay, we have quite a few questions. Okay, the gentleman right in front, just stand up and give your name and institution or whatever, and then your question. And make it a question, not a comment.
Okay. Good evening, sir. My name is Srijan, and I'm not a student of working now. I'm not from the legal background. But still, my question is regarding, as you said, about history being taught to us in one certain manner. And of course, with every government, there are a few controversies associated, and everything is there. But the most common thing associated with this government is this term saffronization. Without getting into any such controversy, if we were simply to, if we expect of the government to talk more about something like Chanakya and that point of view, vis-a-vis the Ashokan point of view, what is, why is it that we're not able to do that yet? Why is it that the government is not focusing upon that more? Because, without, so to say, changing history, you can just bring in an alternative perspective, which is fairly easy to do in my opinion. So that's my question.
Okay. An interesting question, because as you pointed out, any revisiting of our curriculums, particularly for history, but for any other thing, even political thought, very often goes off into a tangent of a political debate. And this is sad because effectively what this is happening is that we are ending up perpetuating an outdated colonial view of the world, perhaps with a few Nehruvian and Marxist sort of things thrown on top. But basically, even obvious to any of you would be that there is something clearly dysfunctional about what we are taught. And this is sad because very often it destroys our own interest in the subject, because we kind of, somewhere at the back of our mind, feel that we are not quite being told the truth. Now the way to solve for this, my view, is first of all, we need to build build an effort to go back and revisit the primary evidence. The sad fact is that much of this debate is done, whether it's in history or any other subject, without any reference to the original texts, the original archaeology, the original thought processes. And the reason this happens is that we did not build up a alternative set of scholars who would go and do this. So we have a strange situation. The existing pool of scholars and scholarships has either, by the way, fled abroad, and we have lost a lot of our scholars, best scholars, gone to foreign universities. But even those who are left behind are somehow stuck being in this echo chamber where they are perpetuating a certain lines of thought. And any questioning of that line of thought is seen as some sort of a great political assault. But there is no alternative group of people who can go and relook at all of this and rethink and begin writing it. So one of the reasons I come and talk to groups of students like you is, since I have lost hope of the older generation, I am hoping to inspire some of you to take this on. Don't be scared by the fact that very often you will find that the earlier generation of scholars simply do not understand what you're saying. It doesn't matter. All progress is made essentially by coming up with ideas that the earlier generation opposes or does not understand. In fact, a very famous scientist, Max Planck, once said, all progress in science is made one funeral at a time. This is true of every field of study. So one of the things I try to do and come here is to try and inspire and get all of you to say that, look, there are other ways to think about the world. I gave you one. I need not be the end-all way of thinking. You may come up with a completely better way of thinking. Please go ahead and explore these things. Have the confidence to do this. Too much of our scholarship in this country is suffering from essentially regurgitating rubbish. And once for some reason it enters into our textbooks, because there is no revisiting of it, it goes on and on. It is almost as if someone somewhere said the sun goes around the earth and now we cannot evict it, even though we all know that it's the other way around. Yes?
I'm Ashwini Singh from I'm doing leadership in IGF. I would prefer Hindi.
हाँ बताइए.
Sir, actually my problem is I want to understand the concept of GDP in ancient India. GDP का concept ancient India में क्या था? Because right now we were discussing about this GDP concept of GDP, the 5 trillion economy. So गांव की जो condition होती है, गांव में suppose थोड़ा सा लंबा होगा but एक शादी होती है तो गांव में जो भी यूज होता है शादी में तो लोग एक दूसरे के घर से लेकर आते हैं, वो किराए पर नहीं आता है. तो जब हम उसे किराए पर लाते हैं या किसी से लेते हैं तो वो जीडीपी में ऐड होता है, क्योंकि मैक्सिमम चीज़ें वहीं से ले बारो कर लेते हैं. तो ये ऐसी ट्रेडिशन हमारे गांव में और देश गांव का ही मैक्सिमम.
सी देखिए, ये जो जीडीपी यानी सकल घरेलू उत्पादन जो हम इस्तेमाल करते हैं आंकड़े, वो आंकड़े ये जो और जिस सिद्धांतों पे हम लोग इन आंकड़ों को मतलब इनका संकलन करते हैं, वो ये कोई मतलब ये जो आइडिया है पुरानी नहीं है. ये सिर्फ द्वितीय विश्व युद्ध में ये शुरू हुआ था, और वो भी युद्ध के समय हम लोग किस तरीके से वॉर प्रोडक्शन को किस तरीके से उसका मतलब मैनेजमेंट किया जाए, उसी के लिए इस पूरे मतलब ढांचे को बनाया गया. तो युद्ध के बाद कुछ लोगों ने ये सोचा कि अच्छा ये बहुत मतलब इसका इस्तेमाल शांति के समय में भी किया जा सकता है. तो इसी तरीके से ये जो सकल घरेलू उत्पादन का जो ये कॉन्सेप्ट है, इसको बनाया गया. और ये एक तरीके से अच्छा ही है, क्योंकि जिस चीज़ को हम लोग अच्छी तरह से नापते हैं उसको ठीक से हम मैनेज भी कर पाते हैं. तो एक तरीके का एक ढांचा है, एक अर्थव्यवस्था के बारे में सोचने के लिए एक ये मतलब एक ढांचा है. लेकिन ये सोचना कि ये इसलिए हम लोगों को इसकी मतलब इसको एक भगवान की तरह हम इसका पूजना, ये भी आप सही कह रहे हैं, ये गलत है. जैसे चाणक्य के समय में ये इस तरीके से उत्पादन को सोचते ही नहीं थे. वैसे उस समय में आर्थिक जो व्यवस्था थी अभी से कहीं भिन्न थी, और उस आर्थिक व्यवस्था में आपको शायद आप मालूम नहीं हो किस तरीके से उसको गिनते थे, मुझे मालूम नहीं है, पर कम शायद इतना तो करते ही होंगे कि गवर्नमेंट रेवेन्यूज कितना है, या उत्पादन विभिन्न मतलब शाखाओं में कैसे हो रहा है, इसका वो लोग किसी तरह से करते थे. क्योंकि कुछ लगता है उनके अर्थशास्त्र में कहीं कहीं दिखता है झलक कि इस चीज ऐसे आंकड़े थे शायद, लेकिन उनको सब मिला के ये जीडीपी की तरह एक आंकड़ा एक लाना वो शायद नहीं करते थे. ये तो 20वीं सदी का ही कॉन्सेप्ट है, और अब ये यूजफुल कॉन्सेप्ट है. लेकिन मैं आपकी बात मानता हूँ कि इसको इसके आधार पे हम लोग आर्थिक व्यवस्था का मैनेजमेंट करते हैं, ये ठीक है. लेकिन मैं समझता हूँ आप क्या कह रहे हैं कि इसके बारे में दूसरे तरह से भी सोचा जा सकता है.
Hello sir, my name is Chaitanya Kumar Varma. I am from National Law University, Punjab. So basically my question will revolve around the judiciary. So you have given us a different perspective to understand how the economy works, how the society works. But the social infrastructure which the judiciary is trying to build on a Western universal notion of equality, of gender equality, all the notion which is prevailing, how do you see it? Whether it is a transform or whether it is a reform, because we are nowhere looking at the Eastern society, Eastern ideology or Eastern philosopher for that matter. Supposedly, like I was going through the judgment of Justice Chandrachud, this is the section 377. He has primarily relied on Lord Diplot's statement, but we have discussed Mahabharata, we have discussed all the historical aspects, but nowhere we have seen that the Eastern impact or our historical impact has been reflected in that particular judgment. How do you see this transformation or per se reform in that Western society to be transforming into an Eastern look, or the Eastern culture imbibing in our judges to giving in an Eastern form to have to like preserve our cultural heritage in that?
So I will not like to comment on a specific judgment, but the point you have made is that when our judges make some sort of a directional change, they rely almost entirely on Western precedents or Western conception of things. The same judgment could have quite easily have, in this specific case, could have easily been made using an entirely Indian argument, but almost very rarely is done. It is not the fault of the particular judge, because the entire framework has been set up in this way. Part of it is, of course, we inherited a colonial system, so we continued with it, so therefore the traditions and all continued. But 72 years after independence, the fact that we are almost entirely remain colonized in our heads happens because of a number of reasons. First of all, it happens because very much our entire training is done in a particular way. And why is our training done in this particular way? Because we have not gone back to first principles and begun to think about these things. And so, as I said, one of the reasons I like to come to events like this and speak to you, why am I spending my Saturday afternoon coming and speaking to all of you? Because it's important. It's important because I need to begin to get the next generation to begin to think that there is other ways of thinking about it. Because if we do not do this, what happens is that at some level, many of even if you come to the same conclusion, if its roots are not within our own cultural context, you will end up, unfortunately, the nuances of it will be horrible. Or you may think you are trying to solve a problem a particular way, but you may be adding to the problem in another way. So if something is not properly rooted, my view is that it unnecessarily leads to distortions which are entirely and easily avoidable. Secondly, what it does is it perpetuates a certain form of insidious colonization, which is quite harmful. Why should we somehow feel that quoting a precedent from a former colonial power is somehow the correct way to go? I mean, after all, why not quote from a Japanese context? So the point is that I'm not making a case here merely for a purely Indic view of things. If you want to be open your mind, then open your mind in every direction. That's what the Rig Veda says. Let ideas come from every direction. Why should they only come from the North Atlantic? Why not from Singapore? Why not from China? Yes.
My name is Chirag. I'm a physics scholar from IIT Madras. Like you said, in last 60, 70 years, the literature is the reason or based on which we have our textbook, and that is putting us into one type of ideology. Now, for students or even after being awakened, for any research scholar, he has to go through a stringent criteria of getting something published other than quenching his thirst regarding his ideology or whatever he thinks. Now, how can he get something published? Because we have some problem like Nehru or some kind of thinking already put up in the reviewers of the journal papers, and we cannot create a journal.
So I know there is still a lot of problems with in journals and academia, but I have a feeling that things are rapidly changing. I can tell you in my own experience, it would have been very difficult 10-15 years ago for me to even publish on the subjects I write about. I write history and I write about all kinds of subjects, and it would have been very difficult for somebody with my intellectual preferences to publish, and yet it has dramatically changed in the last 50 years. Now, it hasn't changed to the same extent in academia, I agree, but I can clearly see that at least in general media, thanks to the opening up of blogs, and even in mainstream media now, you see a lot more openness. It will happen in academia too. So I would say somebody has to stand up and begin pushing, and the universe begins to move. If you push, the universe changes for you. So you have to have the confidence to begin writing, but the quality of the scholarship has to be absolutely impeccable. I think the time has come to begin to write new material, and if you have difficulty publishing it, we'll find ways of getting you published. But my own sense is you'll be surprised how fast the doors will open. There are many places where many good heads of department, vice chancellors have come to me and said, there is simply no interesting new scholarship coming out. There are places who are waiting for you. So please write new material. If it doesn't get published, it's a different matter. We will then look at it. My own sense is that you will be surprised how quickly you will get published. First have the confidence of writing the stuff you want to write. Make it good quality. There's no point in writing new but rubbish. It has to be good quality. If it doesn't get published, we'll have this discussion. But have the confidence of writing it first.
So my name is Shaurya, I am a law clerk in the Supreme Court. I was interested in knowing how taxes were calculated back in the day. So does Kautilya talk about how taxes would be calculated, or what role, how's the criteria?
So, Kautilya's Arthashastra, pick up a copy by the way, there's a decent Penguin copy by translation by a guy called Rangarajan or something like that. Pick up that book, glance through it once, the first time it will make no sense to you. So I'm warning you,
Yeah.
it's a book that requires some patience because it's written in a different context. So you'll have to spend a little bit of time letting your eyes reset. But then, go to the chapters on taxation and so on. Some of it is quixotic because one section bit will be here and then somewhere else totally different. But anyway, you will find enough material in one place, and after a while it will begin making sense. But he then goes into fair detail about how for example, individual items are to be taxed, how much customs duty is to be placed, and so on. And he's quite comprehensive in the context of his time, obviously. And he also has a lot of fines that he has. So there's a lot of fines. It's not just and user charges, for example, are also specified. For doing ABC, so many panas have to be done, and so on. Now, it's quite possible that what we are reading is not exactly what he had done, because the text may have been changed many times along the way. But nevertheless, it will give you some flavor of how they used to think about it. It will also interest you to know that Kautilya was totally against prohibition. Okay, so he writes there that he quotes that various scholars have viewed that prohibition is a bad idea, but then he says that prohibition is a bad idea. The king has no business interfering with the citizens. This is part of his limited state view of the world. He clearly disliked moralizing, which is very different from Ashoka's view. He then says all of this should be regulated. So since you're a lawyer, you will understand. His view on sort of vices is very clear. Regulate, do not prohibit. So same thing he does with prostitution, for example. He does not moralize about it at all. He sees that as a practical business which has to be regulated because there are clearly vices related to it, and he regulates it how a new prostitute can be brought into the profession. So there is a official whose job it is to make sure that she has not been forced into it, for example, in any way, and so on and so forth. So there are many, and that no violence is done against them. So it is quite interesting. But on the other hand, he's not prohibiting it. So this is what is interesting about Kautilya, that he has his view of the world. He is quite very much about limiting the state from having this intrusive, welfarist kind of approach. I think I'm coming to the end of mine. I'll take two more questions. The gentleman here and the one behind me.
कल नेशनलाइजेशन ऑफ बैंक की 50वीं सालगिरह थी, तो some are saying that it was a great blunder, and some may say that it was that time that decision has to take or had to take. So what's your view and what's your take?
That's one question. And the gentleman behind you?
My name is
this question.
Huh.
So I was listening to Shekhar Gupta yesterday. So he was telling that government, yes, they have intention to again that this decision of nationalization of banks should be reversed, but they are shying away from.
Okay. Okay.
So what is your opinion?
So yeah, the same question. Yeah, another question.
My name is Amandeep and I'm a research intern at IAPA. I had a question regarding the comments that you made, that is the government at present or the administration now still in the default Ashokan mode, you think, or is it tilting towards the Chanakyan mode like slowly? And related to that, like, do you think that, you know, even if the government like was going in that direction and we have a strong state at the central level, but there is a disconnect always in the policy implementation, like policy makers like you that draft like well-meaning policies, but at the ground level or the third tier level and the mid level, the implementation capacity and that Ashokan default mode is there. So
Yes.
the weakness of that.
So I'll answer this. So let me answer this question first, and it relates, by the way, to the second question as well. You're absolutely right. Our default mode is the Ashokan one. Even those who argue against it end up becoming entrapped in it, because it has now come to pervade our entire thinking process. This is what we are taught. This is how our bureaucracy is. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is to get people to actually see that, you know, we are completely drowning in this way of thinking, that there is an alternative way of thinking, many alternative ways of thinking, and that this default causes all kinds of damage. That while you may say minimum government, maximum governance, you have to actively drag the system in one direction. If you take your eyes off, it goes back to it. And that's because that is the ethos of not just the bureaucracy and the government, incidentally even of the citizenry. Citizenry actually expect that the state will intervene in a particular way, not realizing that this exact thing leads to the problem. So, you know, for example, if you have a problem, say in a sporting body, you actually expect the state in some fashion to come in, intervene and take it over. The fact that that community that is related to that sport should do and figure it out simply does not occur to us. We actually expect that either the government or the Supreme Court or somebody will intervene and sort it out. This is an intrinsically Ashokan view. And while even if it does a good job in that particular case, the damage it does on a wider scale by perpetuating this wrong approach is actually quite, is very damaging. Now, related, by the way, to this bank nationalization issue, should in 1969 we have nationalized the banks? On that, I would argue absolutely not. Because the subsequent history of what happened with the banks is not a positive one. Yes, there were many problems with the banking system not being wide enough. Efforts should have been made to use other means of opening up the banking system. If you look at all the losses and other misuses of the banking system since then till now, including the current NPA thing that we are currently unwinding, it's a very large price we have paid for it. And this, what was sad is it wasn't even the first instance of doing this. In the 1950s, in the mid-50s, we had done a similar thing with the insurance sector. And the first thing that happened after doing that was something called the Mudra scam. Right? 1956. So the first thing that happened after a nationalization of a financial institution was a scandal, which was interestingly brought out in Parliament by the then Prime Minister's son-in-law. Feroz Gandhi was the one who, and then Nehru never spoke to him ever again. And his then Finance Minister TTK had to resign because of it. So it was a major scandal, and yet 15 years later they nationalized the banks. But this was a part very much of two things. One is, one can have a positive view and say that they were genuinely mistaken about the thinking about the world, that the Ashokan view at that point hadn't been clearly disproved, so this was how the world thought about it. it turned out to be the wrong path, but that's at least, or you can have the cynical view that this was